270 men on tiny ships held off 23 battleships and cruisers for 2 hours. The complete story of Taffy 3. Imagine waking up before sunrise on the most ordinary morning of your life. You do your job. You drink your coffee. You follow your orders. And then, without any warning, without any preparation, without any chance to run, the largest, most powerful naval force ever assembled in the history of naval warfare comes over the horizon, pointed directly at you. And the only thing standing between that monstrous fleet and 130,000 American soldiers on the beach is you, just you, and a handful of tiny ships that were never, ever designed to fight a battle like this. That is not a story from a movie. That is not a scene someone wrote to sell tickets. That is what happened on October 25, 1944, off the coast of Samar Island in the Philippines. And what those men did that morning, those 270 men, on those small, slow, undergunned ships, is one of the most breathtaking, heartbreaking, and genuinely miraculous acts of courage in the entire history of naval warfare. Welcome, and today we are going to go through every single minute of that battle. We are going to understand who these men were, what they were up against, what drove them to charge directly into the guns of battleships with weapons that could barely scratch the paint, and why, decades later, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz himself said that what Taffy 3 accomplished was, in his own words, nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty. So let us start from the very beginning, because to truly understand what happened on the morning of October 25th, you have to understand the world those men were living in. It is 1944. The war in the Pacific has been grinding forward for nearly 3 years. After Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, Japan had swept across the Pacific with devastating speed, taking island after island, pushing American and Allied forces back. But by the middle of 1944, the tide had turned. The United States Navy had rebuilt, retrained, and was now pushing back hard. American forces were island-hopping across the Pacific, getting closer and closer to the Japanese home islands with every month. And now, in October of 1944, General Douglas MacArthur was about to fulfill a promise he had made 2 years earlier, when he had been forced to retreat from the Philippines. He had looked back at those islands and said, with absolute conviction, "I shall return." And now he was returning. 130,000 American soldiers were going ashore at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. It was one of the largest amphibious operations of the entire war. And the success of that landing, the lives of those soldiers, the future of the entire Pacific campaign, was on the line. Japan knew it too. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood that if the Americans took the Philippines, it would cut Japan off from the oil and resources it desperately needed from Southeast Asia. The war would be effectively over. So Japanese High Command put together one final, desperate, all-or-nothing gamble. They called it Operation Shogo, which means, in Japanese, Operation Victory. And it was, by any measure, one of the most complex and audacious naval strategies ever devised. Here is how it worked. The Japanese divided their fleet into several forces. One force, the Northern Force under Vice Admiral Ozawa, was made up of carriers. But here is the twist. Those carriers were largely empty. They had almost no planes left. They were essentially a giant, floating decoy. Their job was to sail south and look incredibly threatening, drawing the powerful American Third Fleet, commanded by the aggressive and confident Admiral William "Bull" Halsey, up north and away from the landing zone. While Halsey chased the decoy, the real punch, the Japanese center force, would come from the west. This was an enormous, heavily armed fleet led by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. It included the most powerful battleships Japan had ever built. Chief among them was the Yamato, 72,000 tons of steel, equipped with guns that fired shells the size of a small car. Alongside the Yamato was her sister ship, the Musashi, as well as the battleships Nagato and Haruna, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Kurita's job was to punch through San Bernardino Strait, sweep down the coast of Samar Island, and smash into Leyte Gulf, destroying the invasion fleet and the men on the beaches before they could dig in. It was a plan built around deception, sacrifice, and overwhelming force. And it almost worked. Because here is what actually happened. Halsey took the bait. When he spotted Ozawa's carrier force to the north, he went charging after it with virtually his entire Third Fleet. He pulled almost every heavy ship away from the landing zone and went north, leaving only a thin, scattered screen of escort ships to protect the invasion. And the main American 7th Fleet under Admiral Thomas Kinkaid was fully engaged to the south, fighting another Japanese force that was trying to come in through Surigao Strait. That battle was won by the Americans, but it meant that Kinkaid's heavy ships were far to the south, out of position, low on ammunition, and exhausted, which left a gap, a wide-open, terrifying gap, right at the northern end of Leyte Gulf. And that gap was where Kurita was headed. Now, in that gap there were some American ships, but they were not warships in the traditional sense. They were what sailors called jeep carriers, small escort carriers, sometimes called baby flat tops. They were, in essence, merchant ships that had been converted to carry aircraft. They were slow, with a top speed of just 18 knots. They were lightly built, with thin hulls. They were never designed to fight surface battles. Their job was to provide air support for the soldiers on the beach, to fly patrols looking for submarines, to perform the kind of routine, unglamorous work that supported the big operations. These escort carriers were organized into 3 groups, each given the radio call sign Taffy. There was Taffy 1 to the south, Taffy 2 in the middle, and Taffy 3 to the north, about 40 miles off the coast of Samar Island. Taffy 3 was the group closest to San Bernardino Strait, closest to where Kurita was coming from. Taffy 3 was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague. Admiral Sprague was a career naval officer, experienced, professional, competent. And on the morning of October 25th, he had absolutely no idea that the most powerful Japanese fleet left in the entire Pacific had just come through San Bernardino Strait during the night and was heading straight for him. Now let us talk about what Taffy 3 actually consisted of, because this is crucial to understanding just how insane the situation was. Taffy 3 had 6 escort carriers: the Fanshawe Bay, the St. Lo, the White Plains, the Kalinin Bay, the Kitkun Bay, and the Gambier Bay. Each carrier had a complement of about 28 aircraft, a mix of Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and FM-2 Wildcat fighters. To protect these carriers, Taffy 3 had 3 destroyers, the Johnston, the Hole, and the Heermann, and 4 smaller destroyer escorts, the Samuel B. Roberts, the Dennis, the John C. Butler, and the Raymond. That was it. That was Taffy 3. 13 ships in total. The biggest guns they had were 5-inch guns on the destroyers. 5-inch guns. And even those, the shells could not penetrate the thick armor of a Japanese battleship or heavy cruiser. They were, in terms of firepower, essentially carrying the naval equivalent of water pistols to a tank fight. Now, on the other side, Kurita's center force. For battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, 23 ships in total, armed with guns ranging from 8 inches to 18 inches in diameter. The Yamato's main guns could fire a shell 26 miles. They could sink any ship in Taffy 3 with a single hit. Several of those ships individually outweighed the entire Taffy 3 force put together. On paper, this was not a battle. This was a massacre waiting to happen. At 6:37 in the morning, an American pilot flying a routine anti-submarine patrol south of San Bernardino Strait looked down and saw something that made his blood run cold. There were ships down there. Big ships. He flew lower to get a better look. And when he radioed back his report, his words were almost impossible to believe. He said, and I want you to hear this because this is the actual report as recorded by naval historians. I can see pagoda masts. I see the biggest meatball flag on the biggest battleship I ever saw. Pagoda masts were the distinctive, stacked, multi-level superstructures on Japanese warships. And the meatball flag was the red sun on the white field of the Japanese naval ensign. Admiral Sprague received this report and initially could not accept it. He demanded positive identification. He thought there must be a mistake. But then his radar operators started picking up contacts. Big ones. Multiple ones. Coming in fast from the north. And then the color-coded splashes started appearing in the water around his ships. The Japanese used different colored dye in their shells to help with targeting at long range. Red splashes, yellow splashes, green splashes, like some terrible, deadly fireworks display erupting all around the tiny American fleet. And at that moment, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, sitting on the bridge of his flagship, understood what he was looking at. He was looking at the end. He had the most powerful Japanese surface force left in existence bearing down on him, and he had nothing that could stop it. But here is where the story of Taffy 3 becomes something more than a military history. Here is where it becomes a story about what human beings are capable of when they are pushed to the absolute edge of everything. Sprague did not freeze. He did not panic. He did not beg for help and sit still while the Japanese closed in. He immediately started doing everything in his power to survive. First, he turned his ships to the southeast, running as fast as those slow, underpowered carriers could go, trying to gain distance. 18 knots, trying to outrun Japanese ships that could make 30 knots. He knew they could not outrun them, but every minute mattered. Every 1,000 yards of distance was another few seconds of life. Second, he ordered his ships to make smoke. Thick, black, oily smoke, billowing out behind the fleet, trying to hide the carriers from Japanese gunners. The smoke screens that day were extraordinary. Sailors would later describe the water and air around Taffy 3 as looking like the entrance to the underworld, wrapped in smoke, lit by the flashes of enormous guns, shaken by the concussive blasts of shells that were punching down from the sky like hammers from a god. Third, Sprague radioed for help. He got on the radio and screamed a message that went out to every American ship in the region. He told them what he had. He begged for air support, for surface ships, for anything. And at first, the response was essentially silence. Because Halsey was far to the north, chasing the carrier decoy, and Kincaid's fleet to the south was spent and out of position. Taffy 3 was alone. But fourth, and this is the moment that defines the entire battle, Sprague ordered his destroyers and his aircraft to attack. Attack. Not defend. Not screen. Attack. He ordered the small ships to go straight at the Japanese fleet. He ordered his planes to launch immediately with whatever they had loaded, even if they were only armed for anti-submarine patrol. Even if they had no torpedoes. Even if they had nothing but machine guns. He ordered them into the air, and he ordered everything that could float and shoot to go forward, directly toward the enemy. Think about what that order meant to the men who received it. Think about standing on the deck of a destroyer, a 2,700-ton ship designed to fight other destroyers or submarines, and being told to go attack a battleship that weighs 72,000 tons and has guns that can hit you from 26 miles away. Think about what that feels like. Think about the word suicidal not even beginning to cover it. And they went. They went anyway. Let us talk about the USS Johnston first, because the story of the Johnston and her commander, Ernest Evans, is the beating heart of everything that happened that morning. Commander Ernest Evans was a remarkable man. He was part Cherokee, born in Oklahoma, a career Navy officer who by all accounts was one of the most fearless and aggressive commanders in the entire fleet. His men adored him and also feared his expectations. He drove them hard, but he led from the front always. At the commissioning ceremony for the Johnston, before she ever fired a shot in combat, Evans stood before his crew and said something that his sailors never forgot. He told them that he intended to go in harm's way, and that anyone who was not prepared to fight to the death should transfer off his ship. That was the man commanding the Johnston on the morning of October 25th. When Sprague gave the order to attack, the Johnston did not wait for specific instructions. Evans pushed his ship to full speed, 35 knots, and pointed her bow directly at the Japanese fleet. He ordered his gun crews to open fire and told his torpedo crews to prepare to launch. And the Johnston went, alone at first, charging straight toward 4 Japanese heavy cruisers that were leading Kurita's advance. She was making smoke, zigzagging, taking hits, firing back. She closed the range from 13 miles to 10 miles, from 10 miles to 8 miles, from 8 miles to 5 miles. At 5 miles, Evans fired all 10 of the Johnston's torpedoes directly at the heavy cruiser Kumano, and they hit, and Kumano's bow was blown off by the explosion. One of the most powerful heavy cruisers in the Japanese fleet had her bow ripped away by a single American destroyer. Kumano was out of the fight, but the Johnston kept going. She turned and ran a smoke screen, drawing fire from multiple Japanese ships simultaneously. She was being hit. Shells were punching through her thin hull. Men were dying. And Evans, up on his bridge, was walking out from his position, barefoot because the blast had knocked his shoes off, his shirt in tatters, 2 fingers of his left hand shot away, directing the battle with calm, incredible authority. The Johnston was, at certain points in that battle, fighting 4 Japanese heavy cruisers at once. She was weaving and charging and laying smoke and firing her 5-inch guns at ships with 8-inch guns that should have been able to obliterate her from 10 miles away. But she was moving so fast, zigzagging so unpredictably, making so much smoke, that Japanese fire control could not get a clean solution on her. She was too small, too fast, too erratic, too angry to kill cleanly. Now, while the Johnston was charging at the Japanese fleet, the other destroyers were moving to join her. The Hole and the Heermann, both fleet destroyers, launched their own torpedo attacks. The Hole charged to within 9,000 yards of the Japanese line, taking terrible punishment from multiple ships at once, her hull riddled, but she kept firing, kept closing, kept fighting. She fired all 14 of her torpedoes, forcing multiple Japanese capital ships to take radical evasive action. Then she was hit again and again and again. Both her engines were knocked out. She drifted to a stop, ablaze, and slowly sank. She lost 253 of her 302 crew members. Almost no one survived. The Heermann, the 3rd destroyer, added her torpedo attack to the mix, charging in and firing at the Japanese line, then turning to fight the heavy cruisers with her guns. At one point, the Heermann was so deep inside the Japanese formation that she was exchanging gunfire with heavy cruisers at point-blank range. Historians have described it as like a terrier fighting a pack of wolves from the inside. And then there were the destroyer escorts. These were even smaller than the destroyers. The Samuel B. Roberts, in particular, became a legend that day. The Samuel B. Roberts was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland. She was tiny, a destroyer escort, not even a full-size destroyer. But Copeland took her into the fight with the same fearlessness. The Samuel B. Roberts fired 594 rounds from her 5-inch guns in just under 2 hours, firing so rapidly and continuously that the gun barrels glowed red-hot. She fired torpedoes at a Japanese heavy cruiser, hitting her and forcing her out of the battle. And when her ammunition was nearly gone, when she was burning and taking on water, she was still trying to fight. She was eventually hit by 3 14-inch shells from a Japanese battleship that punched completely through her hull and detonated inside her. She sank fighting. She lost 89 of her 224 crew members. Men who survived the sinking of the Samuel B. Roberts said that she fought like a destroyer. And when the story was told afterward, the phrase that attached itself to her was one that has stayed with her ever since. The crew called her the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. Now, while all of this was happening on the surface, something equally extraordinary was taking place in the air. Taffy 3's aircraft had been launched immediately when the battle began. But here is the thing. Most of them were armed for anti-submarine patrol or close air support of the troops on the beach. They had depth charges instead of torpedoes. They had small bombs. Some Wildcats were armed only with machine guns. They were going up against one of the most heavily armored fleets in the world. And they went in anyway, over and over and over again. The pilots made attack run after attack run. When they had dropped their bombs, they came back and strafed with their machine guns. And when they were out of ammunition, they made what became known as dry runs. They dove on Japanese ships with empty guns, with empty bomb bays, just trying to force the ships to turn away, to break their formation, to disrupt their targeting. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners who did not know the American planes were empty fired at them anyway, causing the Japanese fleet to maneuver defensively against threats that were not real. There is something almost unbearably moving about that. Those pilots, knowing they had nothing left to drop, knowing their planes could not hurt those ships, diving anyway. Because it might help. Because the destroyers below them were fighting and dying, and they would do anything they could, even this meaningless, futile, beautiful thing. Aircraft from the other Taffy groups joined in as well. Taffy 2 sent its planes, even though those men had no obligation to be in that fight. They came anyway. More than 200 sorties were flown against Kurita's fleet during the Battle of Samar. The planes damaged multiple cruisers, killed officers on bridges, destroyed fire control systems, and constantly forced the Japanese fleet to turn and maneuver when it should have been closing in for the kill. Now let us talk about what this battle looked like from the Japanese side, because it tells us something absolutely crucial about how the American counterattack actually worked. Admiral Kurita was sitting on the bridge of the Yamato, looking at this chaos, and he was confused. He had expected to come out of San Bernardino Strait and find almost nothing between him and the invasion fleet. Instead, he found an American force that was screaming and fighting and launching planes and torpedoes and smoke, and he could not understand it. His ships were being hit, being damaged, being sent off course. And then, in the chaos, something remarkable happened to his perception of the battle. Kurita thought he was fighting fleet carriers. He thought the escort carriers were fleet carriers, the real, full-sized aircraft carriers that the American Navy used in its main battle groups. He thought the American destroyers were cruisers. He thought he was fighting a much larger and more powerful force than he actually was. Because nothing about the way Taffy 3 was fighting made any sense to him. You do not send destroyers straight at battleships unless you have a massive fleet behind you providing cover. That was the logic. That was the doctrine. And yet here were these destroyers, charging at him like they were the most powerful ships in the ocean. The aggression of Taffy 3, the insane, reckless, glorious aggression of those sailors and pilots, made Kurita believe he was facing something far larger than the truth. And that confusion worked its way into every decision he made. The battle raged for just under 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours of almost incomprehensible violence and chaos and heroism. During that time, the Japanese did score hits. They scored many hits. The escort carrier Gambier Bay was hit repeatedly and sank. The destroyers Johnston and Hull were sunk. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts was sunk. The other carriers were hit and damaged. Men died in numbers that are terrible to contemplate. Over 1,000 American sailors lost their lives in the waters off Samar that day. But the Japanese also took losses that no one had predicted. 3 of Kurita's heavy cruisers were sunk or so badly damaged that they had to be removed from the battle. The Chokai was hit so hard by American aircraft that she eventually had to be scuttled by a Japanese destroyer. The Chikuma was sunk. The Kumano had her bow blown off by the Johnston's torpedoes and had to limp away. The Suzuya was hit and later sank. These were not small losses. These were fleet assets that Japan could not replace. And through all of this, through all the smoke and the fire and the shells and the explosions, the Japanese fleet was not closing in for the clean, decisive kill that Kurita needed. They were being harassed and hurt and confused. They were being forced to maneuver when they wanted to advance. They were watching ships go down, watching planes coming at them in wave after wave, watching their formation fall apart under the pressure of an enemy that simply refused to behave the way they were supposed to. At around 9 o'clock in the morning, Kurita made a decision. He called his fleet off. He ordered the Japanese center force to break off the attack and retire to the north. He later said in his official report that he had felt the battle had reached a point where continuing would cost him losses that outweighed any potential gain. He mentioned that he was concerned about the approach of fresh American forces. And there were, in fact, American aircraft coming from other bases now, and the situation was becoming increasingly complicated. But historians have debated Kurita's decision ever since, and many believe that the simple truth is this. The ferocity of the American resistance, the sheer, relentless, terrifying aggression of Taffy 3, had thrown his plans into complete disarray. He had gone into this battle expecting to swat aside a minor screen and sweep into Leyte Gulf. Instead, he had been in a brutal, exhausting, confusing fight for 2.5 hours, had lost multiple major warships, and still had not broken through. And the man was tired. His entire force had been fighting and running since October 23rd. The Musashi, one of his battleships, had been sunk by American aircraft in the Sibuyan Sea the day before. His men were exhausted. His nerves were shaken. And the sight of those tiny American ships coming at him like they had nothing to lose had done something to his confidence that all the training in the world could not fix. Kurita turned north, and the invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf was saved. Let us now talk about the men who died, because this story cannot be told properly without stopping to acknowledge them. Not as statistics but as people. The Johnston lost 186 men. When she finally sank, Evans was last seen in the water swimming. He was never found. He was 26 years old when he commissioned the Johnston. He was 36 when she went down. A Japanese destroyer commander, watching the Johnston sink, came to attention and saluted. That act of recognition from an enemy officer in the middle of a battle tells you something about what kind of fight those men put up. The survivors of the sunken ships, the men who made it into the water, faced another ordeal that was almost as terrible as the battle itself. They spent the next 2.5 to 3 days in the open ocean. Some of them were in shark-infested waters. Sharks attacked repeatedly. Men who had survived the battle, who had survived the sinking of their ships, were pulled under by sharks in those long, terrible days before rescue arrived. Of the 770 sailors who went into the water from the Johnston, the Hull, and the Samuel B. Roberts, many did not survive the wait for rescue. The total American losses for the battle off Samar were catastrophic by any measure. Over 1,000 men killed, for ships sunk, many more damaged, and yet, what those men achieved is one of the most astonishing things in the history of naval warfare. In the weeks and months that followed, the United States government worked to formally recognize what Taffy 3 had done. And in early 1945, Taffy 3, Task Unit April 3, 77, was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest unit award given to American military commands. The citation reads in part, and I want to read this to you because it deserves to be heard in full, for extraordinary heroism in action against powerful units of the Japanese fleet during the Battle off Samar, Philippines, October 25, 1944. Silhouetted against the dawn as the Central Japanese force steamed through San Bernardino Strait towards Leyte Gulf, Task Unit April 3, 77 was suddenly taken under attack by hostile cruisers on its port hand, destroyers on the starboard and battleships from the rear. Quickly laying down a heavy smoke screen, the gallant ships of the task unit waged battle fiercely against the superior speed and firepower of the advancing enemy, swiftly launching and rearming aircraft and violently zigzagging in protection of vessels stricken by hostile armor-piercing shells. With one carrier of the group sunk, others badly damaged, and squadron aircraft courageously coordinating in the attacks by making dry runs over the enemy fleet as the Japanese relentlessly closed in for the kill, 2 of the unit's Valiant destroyers and 1 destroyer escort charged the battleships point-blank and, expending their last torpedoes in desperate defense of the entire group, went down under the enemy's heavy shells as a climax to 2.5 hours of sustained and furious combat. The courageous determination and the superb teamwork of the officers and men who fought the embarked planes and who manned the ships of Task Unit April 3, 77 were instrumental in effecting the retirement of a hostile force threatening our Leyte invasion operations and were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. Those words were signed by the Secretary of the Navy. They were presented by the President of the United States. And they were earned by the blood and the courage of sailors who were supposed to be supporting troops on a beach and instead found themselves fighting a war they had no business surviving. Commander Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His citation described his actions in terms that are genuinely extraordinary to read. It talked about how he charged a Japanese fleet of overwhelming strength, how he fought his ship after it had been nearly shot to pieces, how he led his men with calm and determination even as his ship was dying around him. The Cherokee boy from Oklahoma who had promised to go in harm's way had kept his promise, all the way to the end. The Samuel B. Roberts Commander Copeland was awarded the Navy Cross. Many of the surviving officers and men received Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and other individual decorations. But the Presidential Unit Citation was the unit's official recognition, and it stands today as one of the most hard-earned in American military history. Now, let us also look at the broader consequences of the battle off Samar and the larger battle of Leyte Gulf, because Taffy 3's sacrifice was not an isolated incident. It was the decisive moment in the most important naval battle of the Pacific War. The Japanese plan, Operation Shogo, had failed completely. The decoy operation, which had successfully pulled Halsey north, achieved nothing, because Halsey arrived at the carrier force too late to be decisive, and those carriers had no planes anyway. The southern Japanese force had been destroyed in Surigao Strait, the last time in history that a classic crossing the T battle maneuver was used in actual combat. And Kurita's center force, after being driven off by Taffy 3, achieved nothing. It retreated back through San Bernardino Strait without ever reaching Leyte Gulf. The invasion of the Philippines proceeded. The 130,000 American soldiers on those beaches were safe. MacArthur fulfilled his promise. The Philippines were liberated. And from there, the road to Japan itself was open. Japan never launched another major surface fleet operation after Leyte Gulf. The combined Imperial fleet as an effective fighting force was finished. The naval power that had swept across the Pacific and attacked Pearl Harbor, that had fought at Coral Sea and Midway and the Philippine Sea, was gone. What remained was used in defensive operations, in suicide attacks, in holding actions. Japan's ability to project naval power across the ocean was over. And one of the key reasons for that, one of the moments where the outcome was decided, was those 2.5 hours off the coast of Samar Island, where 270 men on tiny ships looked up at 23 battleships and cruisers and destroyers and said, "No, you are not getting through us." It is worth spending a moment thinking about what drove those men. They had families at home. They had lives they wanted to go back to. They were not machines. They were not superhuman. They were ordinary young men from American towns and farms and cities who had been trained to do a specific job and who, on one October morning, found themselves in a situation so far outside what they had prepared for that there was no manual for it, no plan to follow, no textbook answer. What they had was each other. And they had the knowledge that if they failed, if they turned and ran, if they did the sensible, rational, survivable thing, 130,000 men on those beaches would die. The invasion would be broken. The war would drag on with all the horror that implied. They did not know all of that explicitly, perhaps. But they knew that the carriers behind them were full of men, that the beaches ahead of the Japanese fleet were full of men, and that someone had to hold the line. So they held it. There is a moment in the battle that I think about a lot. It comes from the reports of the pilots who were making those dry runs, those empty attack dives with no bombs and no torpedoes. When they had nothing left, they still went down. They flew straight at those massive Japanese warships knowing they could not hurt them, knowing the Japanese anti-aircraft guns were firing at them, knowing the whole thing was insane. And they did it because maybe, just maybe, one Japanese ship would turn to avoid them and give a destroyer below 60 more seconds of life. That willingness to spend yourself completely, to give literally everything you have even after you have nothing left to give, is something that goes beyond military discipline and training. It is something that comes from the soul. And the men of Taffy 3 had it, every single one of them, on that morning. Now, in more recent years, the story of Taffy 3 has attracted attention in a way that goes beyond the historical. In 2021 and 2022, deep-sea exploration teams made dives to extraordinary depths in the Philippine Sea and found the wrecks of the ships that went down at Samar. The USS Johnston was found at a depth of 6,456 meters, making her wreck the deepest confirmed shipwreck ever identified at that time. Her hull number, 557, was still visible on the bow. Think about that for a moment. More than 3 miles beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea, in darkness and cold that no human being can survive without extraordinary equipment. There she sits. The Johnston, still there, still recognizable. Her number still showing, like she still knows who she is. And the following year, the Samuel B. Roberts was found at nearly 7,000 meters, even deeper, breaking the Johnston's record. The deepest found shipwreck in the world. The little ship that fought like a battleship. She went down further than anyone else. There is something poetic about that. These ships, these tiny ships, these underdogs, these ships that had no business being in the fight they were in, now rest deeper than any others. As if the sea itself wanted to mark their place, to keep them somewhere extraordinary to match the extraordinary thing they did. The Battle of Samar and the story of Taffy 3 has been written about by historians, novelized by authors, discussed in naval academies around the world. It appears in discussions of tactics and courage and leadership in military education programs. Fleet Admiral Nimitz's statement, that the outcome was nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty, has been quoted in nearly every serious account of the battle. Because there really is no rational, purely tactical explanation for why those men survived long enough to drive Kurita away. The numbers do not work. The physics do not work. By every calculation, Kurita's center force should have torn through Taffy 3 in minutes and been in Leyte Gulf within hours. But calculations do not account for what happens when men decide they will not be moved. Calculations do not account for Ernest Evans walking his burning bridge in bare feet with 2 fingers blown off, still directing the fight. Calculations do not account for a pilot with an empty bomb bay diving on a battleship because it might buy someone below another few seconds. Calculations do not account for what happens when a group of ordinary human beings reach down into themselves and find something extraordinary. And here is what I want you to take away from this story. Not just the tactics, not just the ships and the tonnage and the casualty figures, but this: there will always be moments in any endeavor, in any life, where the numbers do not favor you. Where everything logical says back off, give ground, this is not survivable. And in those moments, the question is not whether you have the right equipment or the right plan or the right position. The question is what you are made of. Whether you have the kind of thing inside you that Evans had, that Sprague had, that every one of those sailors and pilots had on the morning of October 25, 1944. Taffy 3 was made up of men who should not have won. And they won anyway. 1,000 Americans died that day. They died in the Pacific, far from home, doing a job that nobody talked about much afterward because there were so many other famous battles to talk about. The Battle of Midway gets the movies. The D-Day landings get the memorials. Even the broader Battle of Leyte Gulf is better known than the specific, brutal 2.5-hour fight that took place off the coast of Samar. But ask any serious naval historian, any serious student of World War II, and they will tell you the same thing. What happened in those waters on that morning was one of the greatest acts of collective courage in the history of human conflict. And the men who fought it deserved to have their story told. Fully, completely, without skipping over the hard parts, the fear and the smoke and the shark-infested water and the terrible waiting. They deserve to have their fight remembered not as a footnote to the larger battle, not as a statistic, but as what it was. A miracle that was made by human hands and human hearts. The Presidential Unit Citation says it best. It says the gallant ships of the task unit waged battle fiercely. Fiercely, not carefully, not strategically, fiercely. That is the word that tells you everything you need to know about Taffy 3. They waged battle fiercely, against odds so long that the word impossible barely covers them. And they won. 270 men on tiny ships, 23 battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. 2.5 hours. And at the end of those 2.5 hours, the Japanese fleet turned north and never came back. That is the story of Taffy 3. And it will never stop being one of the most remarkable things that human beings have ever done to each other and for each other on the face of this earth. Rest well, Johnston. Rest well, Hull. Rest well, Samuel B. Roberts. And rest well, all the men who went into the Philippine Sea that morning knowing what was coming, and went anyway. Thank you for listening to this story. If it moved you, if it stayed with you, if it made you think about courage or sacrifice or what people are capable of, share it. Because stories like this one deserve to live forever. And the men of Taffy 3 deserve to be remembered by as many people as possible.